They laughed, actually laughed. Jake spit out his soda. Brooke rolled her eyes so hard I thought she'd pull a muscle. My father didn't even blink. He just leaned back in his chair and let out one of those gruff, disappointed sighs that said more than words ever could. I had waited until dinner was nearly done, after the plates were cleared and everyone was nursing second glasses of wine. I wanted the timing to be right, calm, receptive, open. I'd even rehearsed it in my head all day. "I decided to move," I said. Brooke was the first to smirk. "Like, out of town?" "No, out of state," I clarified. "To South Carolina. I bought a home, on the water." That's when Jake practically howled. "You, Naomi?" The girl who panicked when the blender broke and called me in tears. It was like I'd flipped a switch. I wasn't Naomi, the adult woman with a full-time remote job and 5 years of savings. I was suddenly the family's court jester again. The fragile one. The almost. The girl who cried too easily, apologized too quickly, and dared too often to dream outside the lines they'd drawn for her. Brooke leaned forward, fingers steepled like she was conducting an interview. "What are you even running from? You have no kids, no partner, no mortgage. That's not responsibility. That's a vacation." I could feel my face flush, not from shame, from fury I didn't quite know how to wield. I wasn't running, I was reaching, stretching, finally stepping into something that was mine. But to them, it all sounded like escapism. And then Dad spoke, just one line. "You're not built for solitude. You'll come crawling back in 6 months." Flat, final, like a judge delivering a sentence. He didn't even look at me when he said it. Just took another sip of his bourbon and looked past me, as if I were already fading from relevance. What they didn't see, what they had never tried to see, was everything behind my decision. They didn't know I'd been waking up at 5 a.m. for years, juggling a freelance copywriting gig on top of my salaried remote work, funneling every extra dollar into a separate savings account labeled Freedom. They didn't know I'd spent months researching coastal flood zones, school district ratings for resale value, and HOA fees until I could recite Charleston zip codes in my sleep. They didn't know I'd already toured the house virtually, had the inspection done, signed the papers, and wired the down payment. Because if I told them, they'd find a way to ruin it, drown it in doubt. They always had, ever since I was little. Every time I showed enthusiasm for anything, a painting, a college, a guy, I was met with that same half-smile, the veiled condescension masked as just being realistic. But this time, I didn't ask. I told them. And their laughter, sharp as it was, felt different this time. Because I already had the keys. Because the movers were already booked. Because they weren't laughing at a dream. They were laughing at a reality that scared them more than it scared me. I smiled that night, not because it didn't hurt, but because for once, their doubt wasn't a wall. It was proof I was finally stepping beyond their limits. The sky was gray that morning, the kind of gray that feels like the air is holding its breath. I stood on the cracked concrete of our family driveway, clutching my keys with one hand and the strap of my overpacked duffel bag with the other. The only one there to see me off was Mom. She didn't say much, just rubbed my arm and pressed a paper bag into my hands. "Snacks for the road," she whispered, eyes glassy but dry. Her hug was soft, almost reluctant, as if squeezing too hard might make me change my mind. She didn't ask me to stay, but she didn't tell me she believed in me either. Still, I took that as her way of saying she loved me. It had to be enough. The moment I pulled out of that driveway, tires crunching over gravel like a final exhale, something in me shifted. I wasn't just leaving New Jersey. I was leaving the version of myself they had built, boxed, and labeled. Naomi, the sensitive one, the flaky one, the one who couldn't be trusted with a casserole dish, let alone her own life. But as the cityscape blurred behind me and the green ribbons of highway unspooled ahead, I began to feel it, freedom. Not the glamorous kind, not the movie montage kind, the real kind. The kind that sits quietly in your chest, expanding breath by breath until you realize you're no longer waiting for someone else to tell you who you are. I drove for 11 hours that first day, stopping only when I was too stiff to stretch and too tired to trust myself behind the wheel. The playlist I'd curated, songs that once made me cry, ache, or dream, sounded different now. Not because the lyrics changed, but because I had. They were no longer soundtracks for escape. They were hymns for arrival. And when I finally turned off the highway and onto that unpaved road, with Spanish moss draping the trees like lazy silk, I knew this was mine. This silence, this salt air, this simple claiming of space, it belonged to no one else. The house wasn't fancy, but it was perfect. White cedar siding worn soft by the sea breeze. A wraparound porch with chipped paint and rusted nails. The dock, reaching out like a promise into the marsh, where the water glimmered like cut glass at dawn. I cried that night. Sat cross-legged on the floor beside unopened boxes and cried. Not because I was scared. Not because I was lonely. But because for the first time in my adult life I felt the weight of nobody's expectations. Just my own heartbeat, my own breath, my own voice in my head whispering, "You did it." It wasn't smooth sailing after that. The pipes in the kitchen burst on day 4. A raccoon, bold and relentless, broke in and feasted on a box of granola bars like he'd been invited. A storm hit hard and fast, washing out the only bridge into town and leaving me with nothing but saltines and peanut butter for 48 hours. But every problem I faced was mine. And every solution, even the clumsy ones, carried my fingerprints. I learned to unclog drains. I learned to weather silence. I learned to walk into a local hardware store with questions and leave with answers, pride, and a smile from the cashier who started remembering my name. Piece by piece, hour by hour, I was carving out something sacred, a life on my own terms. Not loud, not flashy, but real. And real, I was learning, is enough. 6 months passed like slow tides, steady, silent, and transformative. I had come to love the rhythm of mornings on the porch, coffee steaming in my hands, the light dancing on the water like it had secrets to tell. My home no longer felt like a bold decision. It felt like an extension of me, weathered, simple, honest. So when I got the group text from Brooke, "Change of plans, we're coming down for the weekend," I didn't even pretend to be surprised. There was no apology, no question of whether it was a good time, just a rolling wave of assumption crashing straight into the life I had built without them. Brooke's vacation to Miami had fallen through. Jake's kids were bored. And suddenly, the sister they'd once ridiculed for chasing fantasy in the mud was their affordable plan B. They arrived in 2 cars, a rented SUV and Jake's hybrid, both packed like they were fleeing a natural disaster. They spilled out with branded coolers, high-end luggage, and an air of reluctant entitlement. Brooke had sunglasses on like she was trying to protect herself from the sight of rural life. Jake's wife, Kelly, clutched her phone like she was already praying for signal. The first thing Brooke said wasn't hello. It was, "This is the driveway. Is this gravel?" I smiled. Keeps the speed down. She didn't laugh. But they stopped short when they rounded the bend and saw the house. It was freshly whitewashed, its cedar frame glowing in the late afternoon sun. I'd trimmed back the ivy, repainted the porch rails, and added teal shutters that gave it just the right pop of color. The string lights I'd hung along the dock swayed gently in the breeze, and 2 Adirondack chairs sat facing the marsh like patient witnesses to everything I had endured. Jake froze halfway up the walk. His eyes did a slow, calculating sweep, from the potted herbs to the wind chimes to the hand-stained porch swing. His wife muttered, "This is yours?" Brooke's sunglasses came off. "Wait, how did you afford this?" I didn't smirk. I didn't gloat. I just met their eyes, one by one, and said calmly, "I worked. I saved. And I stopped listening to people who told me I couldn't." There was a long silence, the kind that feels like a verdict. Jake didn't even pretend to hide his confusion. His jaw tensed the way it always did when he realized he'd underestimated someone. Brooke blinked like she was still trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of her, denim overalls, barefaced, sun-warmed, with the Naomi she used to mock for being too soft. But I wasn't soft anymore. I showed them to their rooms, simple, clean, prepared. No frills, no pandering. I'd anticipated their arrival not with excitement but with clarity. I knew who they were. I knew what they thought of me. And I knew exactly how little I needed their approval now. That evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the light ripple across the water. I could hear their voices inside, awkward, hushed, uncertain. For once, they were the ones out of place. And I was exactly where I belonged. By the second morning, the spell had worn off. The charm of the waterfront, the novelty of the chirping birds, and the scent of briny air, none of it could compete with their deep-rooted instinct to dominate the room. The moment they'd stopped being impressed, they started trying to regain control. That was the real family tradition. Jake was first, standing in the hallway outside his room, shirtless, holding the TV remote like it was a dead insect. "Naomi, there's no cable in here. Just streaming apps." "That's right," I said from the kitchen. "Wi-Fi's strong though. Netflix, Hulu, whatever you need." He grunted, clearly offended, as if a home without ESPN was a personal attack. "Not everyone wants to watch documentaries, you know." I let that one float away, like steam from my mug. Not worth a reply. Brooke emerged a little later, already dressed for an occasion that didn't exist. Head-to-toe linen, sandals that had never seen sand. She walked through the living room like she was inspecting a rental. "It's rustic," she said, fingering the hand-woven throw on the couch. "Like cottagecore with a side of grandma." "That's intentional," I replied, calm and unfazed. "Comfort over trends." She blinked, thrown by the lack of defensiveness. Brooke was used to me shrinking, folding, apologizing when she made snide comments. Now she was meeting resistance wrapped in politeness, and it confused her. And then there was Dad. He'd stationed himself on the porch early that morning, planted like a monarch in his robe and socks, legs stretched, waiting. I watched him through the screen door, the same way I used to watch him in the kitchen growing up, expecting his coffee to appear in front of him like it was summoned by duty. Eventually he called out, "Naomi?" I stepped outside, still sipping my own cup. "Yeah." He motioned to the little table beside him, empty, expectant. "You make any coffee yet?" I smiled gently. "Oh yeah, pot's in the kitchen. I think you know how to work a Keurig." His brow furrowed, not in anger, more like confusion, like a machine had glitched. The code had been broken. He looked at me again, really looked, like he was seeing someone he didn't quite recognize. Inside, Jake was fussing over towels. "These are a little small. You don't have, like, the oversized kind?" I didn't look up from rinsing a bowl in the sink. "I'd have clean towels. You're welcome to use what's here. It's not a resort." He muttered something under his breath, but he didn't press it. Because I wasn't engaging. Because this house wasn't an extension of their kingdom. That weekend wasn't easy. The air was thick with discomfort. They were strangers in my space, and for the first time, I didn't bend to ease their presence. I didn't over-apologize. I didn't serve. I simply hosted, with boundaries. They came expecting Naomi, the soft one, the pleaser, the filler of silences. Instead, they met the version of me I'd built in quiet moments between broken pipes and raccoon standoffs. The woman who didn't need to prove herself anymore, because she'd already done the hardest thing. She'd chosen herself. And now they were being forced to see it. Not just the home I made, but the woman who made it. The final morning arrived with a hush, as if even nature understood something was about to shift. The sky was painted in soft gradients, pale lavender melting into peach, and the water mirrored it all like glass. I stood at the edge of the dock, arms folded against the early chill, breath curling in front of me. Behind me, I heard the creak of slow footsteps. Dad. His gait was still the same, measured, deliberate, like every step was a quiet statement. He didn't speak right away, just stood beside me, hands tucked into the deep pockets of his windbreaker, eyes fixed on the horizon. We watched in silence for a while. A pair of herons flew low across the water, wings wide and effortless. Somewhere nearby, a fish splashed, breaking the stillness for a moment before it all settled again. And then, almost too quietly to hear, Dad said, "I misjudged you." I didn't move, I just let the words land. "This place," he continued, his voice more gravel than usual, "it suits you. You proved me wrong." For a split second, I felt like a little girl again, waiting for approval, for something kind, for any hint that I wasn't just a disappointment dressed up in good intentions. But that feeling dissolved almost as fast as it came because I wasn't that girl anymore. Still, his words struck something deep. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were real, sparse, honest, coming from a man who measured compliments like currency, and in that quiet acknowledgement, something long twisted inside me, unknotted. I didn't gloat, didn't remind him of what he'd said 6 months earlier, didn't repeat the Keurig moment or list the dozens of times I'd been told I wouldn't make it. There was no need. I simply turned to him and said, "Thanks, it suits me too." That was it. No dramatic hugs, no sweeping declarations, just mutual stillness on a dock where the old version of our relationship had finally dissolved into the marshy air. They left that afternoon. Jake was awkward with his goodbye, half hug, half handshake. Brooke tossed off a breezy, "We should do this again sometime." as if this had been a casual girls' weekend instead of the quiet dismantling of old hierarchies. Mom hugged me tightly, pressing her cheek against mine in a way she hadn't done in years. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. A week later, I found Brooke's Instagram post. A filtered photo of my dock at golden hour captioned, "My sister's view. Jealous much?" It had over 200 likes. I didn't comment. Didn't need to. Jake emailed me that same week, asking what apps I used for time tracking and if I had any tips for managing remote projects. I smiled when I read it. The man who once called me Naomi the not-so-employed was now seeking my advice on productivity. But it was Mom's gift that undid me. A package arrived in the mail, no note, just a delicate watercolor of my home, soft brushstrokes capturing the porch, the marsh, and the dock. At the bottom, in her careful script, were the words, "Home is where you grow." I stood staring at it for a long time, heart full but steady. They had come to judge, they left changed. And me? I stayed, rooted, whole. Not to prove them wrong, but because I had finally proven myself right.